morning, students. At least it's morning for me. I'm not sure when you'll be watching these, but welcome to Biology 106. This is your first lecture. We are going to be talking today about Chapter 6, just the very introductory portions. The majority of the course will be in this fashion, where you'll watch just shorter videos covering one little portion of the chapter, and then you will get to move on to other assignments. So you can take notes I have uploaded all the PowerPoint files to Moodle, so you can use those and follow along if you would like. So we're going to start off today with talking about cells. We're talking about cancer specifically in this chapter, but in order to understand what cancer is, you have to have a little bit of introductory knowledge about what cells are. So we have this nice little individual here, nice little female runner, and what we're going to kind of do here is look at how all living things are set up. Okay, all living things are kind of set up in very regular patterns, and we call this the hierarchy of living things. Okay, so if I would kind of start talking about this individual and how her body works, I would inevitably start talking about the different body systems that make up each individual. Okay, so, and we have lots of them. We have a digestive system, we have a circulatory system, urinary system, so we have lots of them. But one of those is the circulatory system. And as you well know, there are many parts of the circulatory system. You have the heart, you have arteries, you have veins, you have capillaries. So we're going to look at one of those organs in the circulatory system, because each system is made up of many different organs. And one of these organs in the circulatory system would be the arteries. And arteries have lots of different types of tissues in them. Okay, one of the types of tissue lines the inside. It's the epithelial tissue. There's also smooth muscle in the middle, and then there's connective tissue on the outside. And each one of those tissues is made up of lots of different cells, and all those cells are going to be doing the same type of job. So in this case, in the smooth muscle tissue, all of those smooth muscle cells are doing the same basic type of job. Okay, so, and again, each of those tissues is going to be made up of lots of different types of cells. So kind of going the other direction, if you would look inside your body, you are made up of millions of cells. Those cells that are doing the same types of job are grouped into tissues. Tissues are grouped together into organs. Organs are grouped together into systems, and then systems work together to make an individual. Okay, so the basic unit of life is the cell, and we're going to look just very briefly into what a cell is. The cool thing about a cell is we think of them as just little blobs of material, but they're actually super, super complex. Each cell is like a tiny factory, and each one of these little blobs inside here we have one type of blob, okay, and it's going to do one type of job. This type of blob is going to do a different type of job. This guy right here, these are mitochondria. They do a certain type of job. The blue squiggly things in this diagram are called the endoplasmic reticulum. You don't need to know that, but it does another specific type of job. So it's kind of like a production factory inside one tiny, tiny microscopic area of a cell. And the part that we're going to be the most focused on is, when we're talking about cancer, is the nucleus. The nucleus is this portion here, big purple guy in the middle. There's a portion on the inside called the nucleolus, or the nucleolus, and it has a more specific function. But in general, what we're interested in here is the nucleus. The nucleus is basically the control center of the cell. And the reason why it's the control center is because it contains DNA. And you've all heard of DNA. DNA is what makes you, you. Okay, it's what differentiates me from my husband, me from my kids. We may have similar DNA, but every individual is different. But on a cellular level, what DNA does is it physically controls every single activity of the cell. It tells the cell when to make proteins. It tells the cell when to divide. It tells the cell when to transport something and release it. Okay, it's going to control the cell. So in order to have a properly functioning cell, you have to have DNA that is functioning correctly. Okay, now you've also probably heard this word here, chromosomes, when you hear DNA. DNA is kind of packaged into little boxes called chromosomes. Okay, humans have 46 chromosomes, and all those chromosomes, when you take them together, compose all of your DNA. Okay, so if I would take a cell out of your skin, and a cell out of your liver, and a cell out of your heart, all three of those cells would have the same DNA, which means they would have the same chromosomes inside of them. And those are just instructions for the cell and tell the cell how to function. Okay, now, when we have a properly functioning cell, it's going to have certain types of behavior. The first thing that a cell typically does is it divides, but it divides in a very controlled fashion. Okay, it doesn't just divide randomly. It receives, the nucleus sends out a signal, and that causes the cell to divide. Okay, and there's two main reasons why a cell would divide. Number one, if our body is trying to grow. So this is mainly going to be for individuals that are young. Okay, my kids are 8 and 5, and so they are still growing. So they are having lots of cell division so their bodies can get bigger. Okay, hopefully I'm not getting a whole lot bigger. Maybe I'm getting wider, but not always taller. So my cells, however, also still divide, not so much for me getting bigger or taller, but to repair cells. Okay, if you get a scrape, you're going to have cell division to repair that. Your body is constantly losing skin. It's constantly, like in your GI tract, it's losing cells, so it has to replenish those. So normal cells divide in a controlled fashion. The second thing that normal cells do is they have something called contact inhibition. And what contact inhibition is, basically just says that cells typically, once they're touching another cell, like these are here, they don't divide. Okay? So let's say this is a line of skin cells right here, and a couple of your skin cells get sloughed off, or you have an injury and there's a space there. Then normal cells are going to divide and fill in that space. And once the space is filled in, once each cell is touching another cell, the cells say, okay, we're good. We filled in the space. No more dividing. Okay, that's what normal cells do. We're going to see how that's different in cancer cells in a little bit. Third, cells typically have a limited lifespan. They don't keep dividing forever. Okay, and this is caused by a couple of different things. First, cells typically, once they reach a certain age or they have divided a certain number of times, they're basically done dividing. And we're not really going to go into the specifics of how that happens, but it has to do with your chromosomes. And once the chromosomes have divided so many times, they basically can't divide anymore. So as we age, or as our cells age, they naturally stop dividing. Okay. A second thing that gives our cells a limited lifespan is a mechanism called apoptosis. Okay. And basically what apoptosis is more generally, we call that programmed cell death. Okay, and I'll give you an example of when everyone has probably experienced apoptosis. If you go lay out on the beach, or you get a sunburn mowing the yard, okay, your skin cells are damaged. That's what the red look to your skin is. It's skin damage. All those cells have been damaged. And so instead of continuing to divide and proliferate that damage, the cell notices, okay, I have damaged DNA, so I am going to go ahead and die so I don't send that damage on to another generation of cells. That is called apoptosis. Okay, once you get a red sunburn, a couple days later, you see a lot of times you peel. That is a whole bunch of cells undergoing apoptosis. They're dying because they are damaged. Excuse me. Fourth thing, and this will make a little bit more sense when we compare this to cancer cells, but normal cells can't recruit additional blood vessels. And again, we'll kind of see what that means in a minute. It'll make more sense when we talk about cancer cells. Fifth, cells typically, in order to function correctly, have to be attached to a surface. Okay, so see how all of these cells are in a line? They would be attached to a surface at the bottom here. Okay, typically this cell can't just fly off the handle and unattach itself and live. When a cell unattaches itself from where it's supposed to be, it usually dies. So typically cells have to be connected to a surface. We're going to see how all of these 5 characteristics, cancer cells behave abnormally. Okay, so how do we get from normal to abnormal? Well, typically cells kind of, they live their life, they start dividing, just how any cells would do. And at some point along the way, sometimes the DNA gets damaged. And we'll talk about how and some of those mechanisms in a minute. But if the DNA gets damaged, instead of growing naturally, it starts growing out of control. And that's what causes a tumor. Okay, now tumors can come in 2 different forms. I'll start with this one first. You probably have heard these words. A tumor is benign if it has no effect on the surrounding tissue. Being female, I'll give a female example. You may have heard someone that has like a cyst on their ovary. Okay, a cyst is a tumor that is not hurting the ovary, like it's not actually impeding the function of the ovary. So therefore it is a benign tumor, or a lot of times, generally people call these non-cancerous tumors. Okay, they are usually removed and they're fine. Some benign tumors, not all, but some benign tumors can actually turn into malignant tumors. And the only difference between these two is that a malignant tumor starts hampering the surrounding tissue. It starts invading the surrounding tissue. So see these little kind of pokey things on the side of the tumor? That is showing that it is invading the tissue that is around it. Okay, and typically, if you think about like your liver, if there is a tumor in your liver, it's pushing the normal tissue and putting stresses on it that the normal tissue cannot function. Okay, so that is what a malignant tumor is. Now, malignant tumors also have the ability to undergo something called metastasis. And you'll see that word on the next slide. But metastasis is when a tumor, cells from a tumor break away and they travel to another part of the body. So let's say this is a liver tumor in the liver, and one of the cells breaks off and travels through the bloodstream to the brain, and it attaches there and starts forming another tumor. That we would call that cancer metastatic, or it has metastasized. And obviously you've heard, I'm sure, that cancers that have metastasized are an issue. Okay, because they not only start invading the tumor, the type of tissue where it started, it's starting to invade other tissues as well. Okay, now how do those tumor cells travel from one place to the other? There's 2 different body systems that circulate through the body, and that's the circulatory system and also the lymphatic system. And you may be familiar with at least the circulatory system. We'll talk about the lymphatic system in a minute. But here is kind of just an example, or it shows you kind of a picture example of how a tumor can metastasize. Okay, so here we have this group of cells that is at this point, this is a benign tumor, okay? It is located right inside the tissue, but it hasn't broken through here. It hasn't invaded the tissue around it. So it is a benign tumor. As that tumor grows, it can break through and start invading the surrounding tissue. At that point, it would be considered a malignant tumor. It has invaded tissue. If that tumor continues to grow, some of it may break off and actually start traveling through the bloodstream or through the lymphatic system, and then it's going to travel to another part of the body. So this is actually, let's say this tumor started in the skin. Okay, and it breaks through to the bloodstream, and it actually moves to the liver, and it stops at the liver, and one of the cells gets stopped. It breaks through into the liver tissue, and then starts forming a tumor in the liver tissue as well. So this type of cancer would be metastasized. It has moved. Okay, so basically what these are, they're skin cells. If you would take this tumor out of this individual and look at it under the microscope, you would see skin cells that have abnormal DNA that are actually growing in the liver. And that's how you can tell that a tumor has metastasized. Okay, so here's our routes getting from one place to another in the body. The circulatory system or cardiovascular system you're familiar with, that's blood traveling through the body. So if a cancer cell gets stuck in the bloodstream, it's going to get moved. The lymphatic system is one that's not as familiar to people. The lymphatic system is basically, its function is to take fluid from the tissue and return it to the blood. Okay, and the reason why, as your body, as blood is moving through the capillaries, here's tissue here. Okay, as blood is moving through the capillaries, lots of liquid gets pushed out into the tissues. Okay, and if we didn't have a way to capture that liquid and return it to the blood, our blood would be very thick and almost solid in nature. Okay, so what our body has is a mechanism to capture all this liquid and return it back to the heart to keep the blood full of liquid. Okay, and the lymphatic system is the system that does that. So it collects fluid and returns it to circulation. Okay, what happens is not only does it collect that fluid, it also is a screening system for disease. Okay, so we have these little things called lymph nodes spread all throughout our body, and the lymph nodes collect that fluid and they check it for disease. They look for bacteria, they look for viruses, they look for cancerous cells. This is one reason why when you get sick that you have enlarged lymph nodes, especially when you have like a respiratory infection, your doctor will feel up in your lymph nodes. Those are usually enlarged because lots of cells are getting collected in those lymph nodes. Okay, so when cancer has reached the lymph nodes, the reason why that's bad is because that means that it is traveling throughout the body. Because once it's in a lymph node, it can go back into the bloodstream and then travel all throughout the body and potentially take root elsewhere. Okay, so that's how the cancer cells actually travel. Now, how is a cancer cell different from our normal cell that we talked about before? Normal cells divide under control. Okay, cancer cells divide uncontrollably. They divide at whim. They do not require a signal to divide. So even if the nucleus is not saying, okay, it's time to divide, the cells are dividing anyway. So they divide very out of control. Second, it loses what we call contact inhibition. Remember, with contact inhibition, cells had to, once the cells were touching each other, they knew to stop. Okay, cancer cells don't care if they're touching another cell. They continue to divide and divide and divide continually. Okay, so it loses that mechanism to stop. Third, cancer cells You can see my drawing in there. Sorry about that. Cancer cells are immortal. They can pretty much divide indefinitely. In fact, if you take a tumor out of an individual, as long as it's given nutrients to survive, it doesn't even have to be inside of a person anymore. One example of this is something called HeLa cells. HeLa cells were taken from a Black woman in the early 1900s, 1930, 1940, forget the actual time, but it was early, and they in the 1900s, and they were kept in culture, and they are still alive today, and they're actually sent around the world for different scientific tests. They can divide indefinitely because they lose that mechanism for mortality. They don't automatically shut off. Fourth, this is the one I said you would understand a little bit more when we get here. Cancer cells have the ability to recruit additional nutrients, additional blood vessels. Okay, normally tissues have the amount of blood supply that they have. They can sometimes get additional nutrients, like if a person is adding adipose tissue or adding fat tissue, we do add blood vessels to nourish that tissue, but normally not exponentially do our blood vessels develop. Okay, cancer cells are a little different. They send out little signals. These little blue things, or that's what that's showing you. It's secreted by the tumor, okay? And what it's saying is, it basically sends a message to the blood vessels, I need more blood vessel tissue. So the blood vessels actually grow into that tumor and provide more nutrients and more oxygen to allow that tumor to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. That process where blood vessels are formed is called angiogenesis. Okay, so tumors have the ability to promote angiogenesis. Okay, and fifth, cancer cells do not need to be connected to anything. Remember how I said earlier, typically if one of these cells decides to like fly off the handle and go somewhere else, it's gonna die. Okay, tumor cells do not have to be connected to a surface. They can metastasize, they can move to other parts of the body and still be living. So they have the ability to metastasize. So that's different. Okay. Now, moving on a little bit in 6.1, pages 115 and 116 in your textbook give you this little chart showing risk factors for cancer. And if you look at these, we have multiple different types of cancer, I guess 9, and it shows you the risk factors for those. And a lot of them are different. Okay, let's see. This one would be exposure to secondhand smoke. There's asbestos. Polyps in the colon is one that's specific. However, there is a couple of things, and one especially, that is common to all of them, and that is smoking. So the very first risk factor for pretty much all cancers is tobacco use. It doesn't have to be smoking. It can be chewing tobacco as well. But tobacco causes over a third of all cancer deaths overall across the board. So it's definitely a very strong risk factor for cancer. The reason for that is because tobacco actually contains over 20 different carcinogens. And carcinogens, basically that's just a term that means DNA damaging substance. Okay, a carcinogen goes into the DNA and breaks it apart. Here's our normal DNA. And when a carcinogen comes into contact with DNA, it breaks it apart. Here it's showing you UV light as a carcinogen, which is definitely one. We're talking about tobacco use here, but UV light is also another carcinogen. It damages DNA. Another way that carcinogens can damage DNA is it increases something called free radicals. You may have heard of a free radical on like a skincare commercial. I hear of them a lot when I see those. But free radicals, what they are is these molecules that are positively charged. Okay, and Molecules don't like to be positively or negatively charged. They like to be neutral. They don't like to have a plus or a minus by them. So we have lots of these free radicals floating around, and they're positively charged, and they're not happy. Okay, and when they're not happy, they start trying to fix their problem immediately. And the way that they do that is they head straight inside your cells to the DNA. Okay, and since it's a positively charged molecule, what it's looking for is electrons. If you remember back from chemistry or in physical science, electrons are negatively charged. Okay, so what these free radicals are doing is they're coming into the DNA and they're pulling off electrons on the DNA as fast as they can because they're trying to make themselves happy. Okay, when they do that, when they start pulling off electrons, what they're basically doing is damaging the DNA. So free radicals pull off electrons, and in doing so, they damage the DNA. Okay, so smoking does a couple of things. It's a carcinogen, so it damages DNA, and one way that it does that is through the production of free radicals. Okay, a second risk factor for cancer is something very American here, a high-fat, low-fiber diet. Pretty much across the board, Americans all meet this criteria. Not everyone, but a high percentage of Americans do. The part of that is because of our propensity to eat out a lot. But the reason why a high-fat, low-fiber diet is a problem, we're going to look at this kind of separately. High-fat, when you take in a meal that is high in saturated fat or other types of fat as well, but mostly saturated fat, saturated fats create lots of free radicals. Okay, so it's going to do the same thing that we talked about in the last slide. Those free radicals from the fat are going to start pulling off electrons from DNA. Second thing is low fiber. Okay, what fiber does, fiber is basically part of your food that you can't digest. Okay, so vegetables like salad, lettuce, broccoli has lots of fiber in it. Okay, but when we don't get enough fiber, what happens is our waste product or our stool moves through the large intestine very slowly. Okay, the more fiber you get, the faster your waste product moves through the large intestine. Now, why is that a problem? Who cares? Well, if you think about that, inside the large intestine where that waste product is moving through, there's cells there. Okay, and it's waste for a reason. Okay, your body can't use it. Sometimes it's dangerous product, sometimes your body just can't use it. But if you have waste sitting in one area for a long period of time, the cells around that waste that are kind of surrounding it, they can be damaged. Okay, they're basically sitting next to a bunch of gunk for a long period of time. So increasing the fiber in your diet will actually cause this to move through your digestive system much more quickly, which causes the exposure that your cells get to that waste to be a lot lower. Okay, now, fruits and veggies, the reason why it's always good to move to more fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables not only have more fiber in them, they also typically are low fat, okay? And third, they contain something called antioxidants. I'm sure you've heard of antioxidants before, but antioxidants relate to these free radicals. Okay, what antioxidants do is it provides electrons that the free radicals can grab. So it will, when you eat broccoli or something that has high antioxidants, the free radicals grab electrons off of the free radicals, or off of the antioxidants, instead of going to your DNA and pulling electrons from DNA. Okay, so antioxidants basically prevent damage to your DNA by giving the radicals something else to grab electrons from. Okay. Third thing, lack of exercise. Exercise benefits, there are lots of them, but one of them is that your immune system works a lot more efficiently when we exercise. Things move through the immune system much more quickly. So therefore, exercise helps diminish cancer risk because the immune system can combat the cancer much more easily. Fourth, obesity. And obesity is kind of a double-edged sword because typically people that are obese, they have a lack of exercise and they also have a high-fat, low-fiber diet. So obesity is kind of a risk factor just because it is going to involve some of the other things that we've already talked about. But another reason why obesity is a problem is fat tissue or adipose tissue stores hormones. Most of our hormones, like estrogen, progesterone, some of the male sex hormones as well, they're all fat soluble, okay? And fat soluble hormones tend to take up residence in fat, okay? So these three types of cancer, breast, uterine, and ovarian, also prostate cancer, your risk for those cancers increase as the amount of fat percentage in your body increases because your body can store those hormones at a higher rate. And the last thing is excess alcohol. And there's kind of a fine line here that most doctors recommend getting a moderate amount of alcohol because it decreases risk for some other diseases. But excess alcohol, and that's defined as more than 2 drinks a day for men and more than 1 drink a day for women. Okay, so excess alcohol can be a cell damager. Okay, and when we add smoking to that mix, that exponentially increases a risk. So let's say that you have, because of your alcohol consumption, you have a 2% increased risk for cancer. Okay, and because of your smoking, you have a 10% increased risk. That means if you're doing both of those together, you actually multiply those 2 risk factors. So there's actually a 20% increased risk of cancer when you add alcohol and smoking together. So when working together, they can be extra bad. The last risk factor is going to be increasing age, which this to me makes a lot of sense because as our bodies are naturally going through life, we're going to come into contact with things that damage our body. And that's going to cause mutations in our cells. And the longer we live, the longer we're in contact with the outside world, and mutations can add up. So obviously, as we get older, our risk factor increases for cancer. Another reason that our risk factor increases is because our immune system becomes less effective and we don't have the ability to fight off cancerous cells. Okay, our body a lot of times identifies those cells as cancerous and gets rid of them. And if our immune system is less effective, then it can't actually get rid of those things quite as well. And that is the end of 6.1 and our first lecture.